Hello and welcome to the AXIOM Insights Learning and Development Podcast. In this podcast series, we focus on driving performance through learning. And in this episode, we're going to be answering really one question. What do you do if you need to set up a learning function from scratch, from a blank sheet of paper? And we'll talk through a few examples of what that looks like. But to dig into this, I'm joined by Jenessa Dowe Jacobs. Jenessa is an executive L&D strategist, an author, a keynote speaker. She specializes in the creation and design of the learning function in organizations from moment one. So hi, Jenessa, and thanks for being here.
Hey, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to talk today.
So let's start off, if you don't mind, by just getting to know you a little better. How did you first get involved in L&D as a profession? And sort of talk us through, just sort of briefly, from moment one to where we are today.
Yeah, so my journey into learning and development was never really about like chasing a specific job title or even following specific patterns. Very early in my career, I was in roles that were tied to operations, to billing, to analytics, and I kept seeing the same things in there. A lot of trends and a lot of breakdowns were happening, not because people were bad at their jobs, but because the systems weren't clear. The tools didn't support the work, and the people didn't have the training that they needed. So that's really what pulled me towards L&D. And I realized that if I could help to fix those things being really the people, the processes, and the products, I could help an entire business run better. So that led me to be the person that companies bring in when people need to be rebuilt or learning and development departments need to be rebuilt. I worked across multiple different industries. I started in healthcare, went on to property management, distribution, medical manufacturing, even large beverage manufacturing, and into sales, gyms, and fitness. And in every role I've been in, the pattern has really been the same. Get in, assess where the friction is, and then build the systems that make the learning scalable, sustainable, and aligned to business goals. So once the infrastructure is in place and automated, then we're able to optimize and really do what the business needs for that. So looking back, every 2 to 3 years, I've been able to build out a fully functioning learning and development department and create long-term value through repeatable systems, not just content. So that's allowed me to move to a lot of different industries. And what really excites me about all of that is being able to empower organizations not only to own learning as a capability, but to be able to grow individuals.
Yeah, and I want to focus a little on the nature of the structure of the learning organization, because I think sometimes, in any facet of the business, there's a tendency to say, well, I'm in consumer packaged goods, or I'm in professional services, or I'm in whatever. And so therefore, my structure and my needs are going to be wholly different, and I need to reinvent the wheel. And it's a leading question. I'm sure you recognize a leading question, but it seems to me that there's a lot more similarity in the way we prescribe, and we talk about this in some of the materials around the CBTM curriculum, for example, the various high level models of the learning structure. But I'm curious to hear your perspective on the building of a enterprise-wide learning platform. How do you approach the sort of the arc of that project, the needs assessment to the fulfillment of that need? Maybe could you give me an example of how that worked? Maybe at a company you've done that, you've taken through that arc.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's true that no two companies are the same, right? But what I found is that the infrastructure underneath a successful learning function often is. So I always start by assessing the 3 Ps: the people doing the work, the process they're expected to follow, and the products and the tools that they're using to do it. And across industries, I found shocking similarities, even in places you wouldn't really expect. So one of the clearest examples I can give is that when I transitioned from healthcare to property management, on paper, those two kinds of organizations couldn't be more different, right? But structurally, the same issues showed up. In healthcare, you had nurses, therapists, doctors trying to document and deliver care with inconsistent systems and no centralized learning. In property management, it was field service technicians, it was property management teams and call centers doing the exact same thing. They're all solving urgent problems, trying to train themselves and the next person, and holding the entire system together with a lack of resources and the best intentions, right? So our patients became properties, and all of our field service technicians are, what they're doing there. So both environments were very decentralized, right? And with people creating thousands of training materials on their own just to get through the day and help the next person get through the day. And while it was very well intentioned, it was very chaotic and it was felt that way. Completely unsustainable. Burnout was sky high, and these companies ran super lean, which means people wore every single hat that was placed in front of them, whether that was theirs to wear or not. There were no clearly defined roles, goals, or rules, which made onboarding inconsistent, performance hard to measure, and retention was really an uphill battle all of the time. So, what I did in those situations was very similar. I began to build infrastructure, and the team that I was working with really worked on systems that support learning as a system, not as a scramble, right? So that means creating centralized repositories. And yes, giving access then to those SMEs and those frontline experts in a structured way so that they can contribute. So we're not relying on L&D to produce everything. Often we'll see a lot of learning and development professionals that come in and try and put a stop to everything, right? Just so they can take the time to sort through what's already existing and what's happening within the organization. But I'll tell you a secret, this doesn't stop the creation of training materials. If your frontline workers are already in the habit of creating materials, they're going to continue creating materials. They probably just won't tell you about it if you put a stop to it, right?
Right.
But if L&D professionals were to create a funnel instead where they can put approval workflows in place, define ownership, align content creation, and make sure that it's fitting into or actually matched to business needs, that really helps to stop the incoming never-ending requests that we see. Because really, at the end of the day, while people and products may change from one company to the next, the infrastructure that supports sustainable learning doesn't. If you build for clarity, consistency, and contribution, you can really scale it anywhere.
Yeah, and I like what you're saying, and I'm going to reframe it slightly. Please correct me if my framing is off. But it seems like what you're doing when you sort of on day one or week one, you want to intentionally be an enabler, not an obstacle. And oftentimes, when folks come in new, especially from the outside or as a consultant, there's a tendency of the existing organization to sort of push away the irritant, and so I think it's important to, like you say, come up with a process where you can embrace the efforts that are necessary to keep the lights on while trying to advocate for something better.
That's absolutely right. Absolutely right. And one of the first things that I definitely do is I pay attention to the language that they're using, specifically what things are called and why. So if we look at that day one and we look at, hey, how do you go in and gather the information you need, or how do you understand, the different learning needs of the organization? It might sound really simple, but naming conventions will tell you everything you need to know about alignment, communication, and silos. So if I see two teams working on the same process, but calling it two completely different things, I can almost guarantee there's a disconnect. Not just in terminology, but probably in understanding and execution and even how they feel about the work that they're doing, right?
Right.
So you can't really build a learning system on top of confusion. So that clarity is so incredibly important. And before I even dive into any kind of content gaps, or platform needs, I start listening very closely to the language people are using, the naming conventions. What are they calling things? And that really helps to inform me and understand the culture and the org chart maybe behind the org chart, or where the breakdowns are happening.
Right. Yeah. The back channel conversations, who knows what, who knows who, or who are, or in some cases, people are doing very similar work in silos that they didn't know existed. Right. So
Exactly.
surfacing all of that is important. Just understanding sort of I hate to use the phrase where the bodies are buried, but it's kind of true.
I like how you use that. That's great.
So once you have a handle then on the strategic learning needs in the organization, what's really the next step? I mean, I know you've talked about people and processes and systems, but that can be a very that is a task that can grow as large as budget permits sometimes. So how do you approach maybe strategically putting some scope around that?
Yeah. So the truth is most organizations really already have what they need. They just are not organized. Usually it exists in tribal knowledge or different workarounds, spreadsheets, sometimes informal mentorship, or even someone's desktop folder that's named training guides that no one else has ever seen, but is like the best thing ever, right?
So
So
that's a
if
gold
that,
mine when you find it, right? Too.
right, exactly, on all the desktop icons.
Right.
But if that knowledge exists, then the business is still functioning, right? And if it doesn't exist, then you've been brought in post audit, last ditch effort, and there's a good chance as leadership already knows that they're planning on cutting their losses or selling the business, right? And that's hard to hear, but sometimes that's the reality of L&D professionals is you may find yourself on that layoff list in a situation like that. And that's not a failure, you're still brought in to do what you need to do, but
Right.
back to that question, once strategic needs are identified and next steps are all about clarity and alignment, which means I really return to the 3 Ps. The people, are the right people in the right seats doing the right jobs, and do they have clarity and authority to do it and do their roles? The process, which means can the work flow from A to Z without constant detours, approvals, or what I like to call going backwards to a BA, which stands for Band-Aid, solutions? And if not, we're looking for what's causing friction and fixing that. And then the product. Are the tools actually supporting the process, or are they distracting from it? Are they creating noise or forcing people into workarounds, duplication of work, or maybe utilizing 2 to 3 to 4 to 5 to 6 different tools that all do the same thing just for tracking? And when I evaluate that within an organization, I look for stops. Where is the point where it feels unnatural and you have this kind of like jarring effect within your workflow? So, any place where work needs to pause, loop back, get escalated, or there's causes for confusion in the person doing it, those stops tell me exactly where we need to intervene. You can think of it kind of like driving a car. Until driverless cars are more accessible, small plug for AI right here, you're going to need to have a driver. You got to have the car itself, and you got to have the fuel or, the tools to get there. So if one of those components isn't working or isn't functioning, it's my job to figure out whether or not we need a better mechanic, we need to find a gas pump, or maybe we need a mental health check-in for the driver.
So let me ask you a little bit about sort of navigating the organizational hierarchy as you enter into an organization, because you think of a large complex company, the perception of learning activities, the perception of learning need may be very vastly different between departments, between levels of the hierarchy. So the C-suite versus frontline might have entirely different pictures of reality. And more often than not, I would imagine that you're going to be brought into a company by, director level. Some senior person is going to recognize that there's a need, but they're going to recognize the need from their perspective. So, how do you sort of approach the internal politics of saying, well, I need executive sanction to make these changes. I need resources to make these changes. I need to bring along all of the staff, if we're talking about employee training, who are going to be, taking advantage of this. So there's a lot of different. This is all in the P for people lane, right? Mm-hmm. But it's the politics and the structure of the organization. How do you manage within the organizational levels?
I think that's almost a great 4th P in there, that politics, because that is one of the biggest challenges that organizations face when it comes to their approach to L&D. And that's a lot of times because they're only able to operate to the level of their experience or their exposure. And what I mean by that is a lot of their experience and their exposure has been in that intervention style training rather than that integration. They see training as something you plug in when there's a problem and someone underperforms. So let's stop, let's train them, and then let's expect them to go again. But you can't just stop, add training, and expect them to go. You have to really integrate learning into existing habits and create lasting change. And another huge challenge of that, then, in that politics side is the stakeholder alignment, right? So everyone says they want the same thing, better performance, stronger onboarding, leadership development, whatever the project is. But I'll guarantee that each person has a slightly different agenda, vision, or project that they think they should take priority to get to the same outcome.
Right.
And rarely are those visions as aligned as people believe they are, just because of the breakdown of communication, as well as the level of experience and exposure within different individuals. So you'll have to forgive me for this one. This is why I always say you don't need 10 to 20 aligned executives to start. You need 3 really great stakeholders. And forgive me on the phrasing for this, but I look for a witness, an accomplice, and an alibi. And I'll tell you what that means. So the witness is really someone who sees all of the gaps clearly, someone who can speak to the pain points and someone others may be ignoring. They help you to build the case for change. They give you context and data, can't provide. They help you to navigate because they've seen it, right? They've seen what's happening in there.
This feels like someone who would typically be mid-level management and has been there for 10 years.
Yes, this is your senior person, right? This is the
Yeah.
one that
Has the scars to show for it, has the context.
Yes, this is the one who's seen something, right?
Right.
And then I look for an accomplice. The accomplice is the partner who's going to help you drive the work forward. This is the person giving you access. This is the one who's pulling in resources. This is the one who's willing to test new ideas with you, maybe sometimes a little bit under the radar, so then you can build the case to bring to the other stakeholders. They're in the trenches with you, and they're really helping you to start the pre-build before the actual build, right? And then your third one is your alibi. This is someone in senior leadership who will protect the space for the work that needs to happen, right? This is going to be one of the top dogs there. And this is someone, when people push back or question the time and investment into learning and development, your alibi steps in and says, oh no, this is important because this is part of the strategy. Let them cook.
So I want to build from there, and I know that it can be a little bit of a bridge to get from individual allies to a learning culture. But I wanted to get your thoughts on, so if there's learning happening in an organization that's perhaps more reactive, most of us would say, well, that's not a learning culture. That's tactical. But can a culture exist? And have you seen sort of learning cultures exist even in organizations where there hasn't been a structure or a name put on it?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. So learning culture absolutely exists, even when there's no formal learning function in place. And what I've found often is that it lives in the small things. This is how people share knowledge informally, whether it's safe to ask questions or how teams support each other when other people or new people join in. But without structure, that kind of culture runs usually on goodwill and over time can lead to burnout. So when I step into an organization, I approach learning culture through the lens of Jim Collins' Hedgehog Concept. Are you familiar with it?
I've heard of it, but maybe for the audience and myself, you
Yeah.
can expand on that.
Yeah, so the hedgehog concept is really the intersection of 3 things. It's what are people deeply passionate about, what drives their economic engine, and what can they be best in the world at. And really, when those 3 things come together, you get something that is impenetrable. And that comes from the parable of the hedgehog and the fox, where the fox is fast, it's cunning, it can do all of the things. But the hedgehog does one thing very, very well, and that's when approached by the fox, it rolls into a ball and becomes 365 degrees of spines all the way around.
Right.
So it doesn't become a meal for the fox, right? And so I've adapted this as a way to assess and grow culture within learning. And when you have the intersection of those 3 things, which is what are people deeply passionate about, and that means what do they love to learn about? What drives that passion? what drives their economic engine and what can they be best in the world at, and map it directly onto learning. So passion. People naturally want to learn what excites them or what makes them feel more confident in their roles. I find out about where that curiosity already lives and build from there. When we talk about economic engine, learning only becomes strategic when it impacts the business. I focus learning that moves the needle, reduces risk, or improves performance, or supports retention, right? And then let's talk about that greatness. What can they be best in the world at? I look for what the organization as a whole can be best at, not just in performance, but how it teaches and supports its people. That really becomes the foundation for the learning culture, in the sense that the culture exists in that intersection, not just one events or the courses or in how learning aligns with people's motivations, but how it leverages the business goals and the company's individuals' very unique strengths. So when I step in, my role really isn't to impose culture, because on the surface, it really already exists. It's just connecting that culture to strategy and then reinforcing it with the right people, the right processes, and the right products. And when you do that, learning really stops feeling like an extra thing and just becomes a part of that organizational culture and how that organization thrives and grows.
So you alluded to what I'll say is outcomes, or we want to get a little bit into the measurement sphere here for a minute. But from the perspective of again a new learning function, where some of your conversations have to be with people in decision making capacities to say, if we do this, better things will happen. So how do you manage those conversations of sort of selling the future benefit of the changes you're advocating and setting yourself up for success, setting the entire learning structure up for success? I know part of it is alignment, but I'd love to hear your approach on managing those conversations, especially in those early moments where the list of unknowns for some of the stakeholders is going to be quite long.
Yeah. So I don't think anything scalable happens without senior leadership support or some form of senior leadership support. So one of the things that I do differently is early on, I focus a lot on listening and figuring out what the business concerns really are, whether that's retention, revenue, compliance, speed to proficiency. And I start linking the learning to those outcomes really early. Then instead of launching a massive initiative right out the gate, I actually look for small, quick wins to align with leadership priorities. That might be fixing one small piece of the onboarding on the region or helping managers reduce turnover over a key team. But really, what this creates is what's called trust drips in there. And you can't fill a bowl all at once unless you turn on the faucet and use all your resources, and there goes your job security, right? So instead, I keep the trust strips going through consistent actions that prove that they're aligned and capable and invested in the same outcomes that the senior leadership, is looking at. Let's say we're trying to fly a plane from Hawaii to California, right? And throughout the navigation, we know the steps that we need to get to be there, but maybe our navigation is off course, so 1 degree of motion every so often helps to get you to the right place eventually. It's just a matter of how much time you have to make those degrees of changes. And my job really isn't to convince them, it's to connect them to why learning already matters and why that 1 degree of change is really going to make that difference and make that sustained change. So from there, I keep the trust drips going in there.
Mhm.
I show up to meetings prepared with metrics that matter based on our destination. I celebrate wins. I loop in leaders and their teams specifically that are succeeding. And I stay very transparent when something doesn't work. And that way we can make that 1 degree change. And over time, these small moments really start to compound. And leaders start seeing you not as the training person, but as a strategic partner who makes their lives easier or their teams stronger. One of the things I've really learned is that every leader really wants learning. They just don't always use that word. So I make sure that I'm speaking their language and not mine. And when you do that consistently, the bridge really builds itself, right? So you're not asking for buy-in, you're proving value in real time.
Right. And getting back to the notion of sort of giving results in the language of your stakeholder, I want to focus on this for a minute because I think it's tremendously important because the business world doesn't use learning jargon. And that's one of the first and easy points of conflict or failure. If we start using terms of art that we understand, our stakeholder doesn't, you're not having an effective conversation at that point. So what I heard you talking about though is having conversations with the stakeholders, with the folks in the business, and understanding first what success looks like to them in their language. And then I love the fact that you can then show up in a meeting knowing what they're looking for and holding out a metric that says, here's how we're tracking toward what you care about in their words.
Yeah, it rarely, like, you won't see organizations that are like, well, what percentage of completion are we at, unless they've got some kind of compliance percentage they have to be in healthcare, right? Really what they're looking for is how much of this learning has actually been applied, and ultimately what does that mean when it comes to managing risk, increasing revenue or decreasing cost, or making people's lives better.
Making people's lives better, making the organization more nimble, perhaps, and that's where I think there's a tremendous opportunity for using sort of the blank sheet of approach to a training function, even in an existing organization, like you say, where there is learning happening, there may be training programs happening. If you give yourself the latitude to say, you know what, we're not going to be hampered by legacy decisions. We're going to sort of take a blank sheet and build today what we need tomorrow. You have the opportunity to build competitive advantage in your own organizational performance because you can make your organization perform better than your competitors who aren't doing that sort of, I don't know, a strategic teardown.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So have you seen people embrace that idea at all in organizations, sort of saying, this makes us a more competitive company? Because I mean that's sort of the holy grail.
Yeah, I've been very lucky in the sense that I had two organizations that I worked with that said, look, we're starting from scratch, ground up. We know there are some existing resources that have already been out there, but we don't want to take any of this with us because one, they were either introducing a brand new business unit, or they were introducing a brand new function, or they were going into this huge change into how they were operating through tools and technology, right? So when you're building a learning function from the ground up, the expectations really have to be twofold. One, build the infrastructure, and two, create the momentum. A lot of organizations ask for results before they've even defined what success looks like. So before we talk about outcomes and focus on setting up the systems that allow us to measure them, we got to figure out, where we're going, right? So often there's no baseline data when these happen because training was either inconsistent, or it was undocumented, or it was reactive, or it physically didn't exist in any way, shape, or form, because we're setting up this brand new creation of unit or development or whatever it might be. So my first job is to define the rules of the game, right? What are our constraints? And then ultimately within those rules, we develop a framework. And then we create what's called freedom within that framework. And what does good look like around that framework when it comes to onboarding, performances, or leadership? What behaviors are necessary to keep all four sides intact? And ultimately, then how do we want to track and put tracks around that,
Right.
But then within that, creating that freedom for people to learn and to grow, and organically and naturally, people will do that because the truth is people are always learning. They will always be learning. They will always be changing. That is the only constant thing about life, is growth. And you will continually be growing. Now, all we do is we set up the tracks and we set up that framework so they have the freedom to learn and grow within that and with the company, instead of on some rogue mission off to some side quest. right?
Right.
So that's really what it is you cannot stop growth and you cannot stop learning. You just need to shape and choose which direction it goes in. And once you have that, you can start to build those measurements and those structures, and those foundations, that really will make that day one so impactful for future employees and for the future of that organization.
So, in the current environment, as we're building new systems, tools, and processes for learning, obviously we can't have this conversation without acknowledging that generative AI tools, agentic AI, and whatever they announce tomorrow, AI enabled browsers just made the news fairly recently as a whole sea change of that industry. So, how, obviously, there's. I'm sure you're as resistant as I am about chasing the shiny objects just for the sake of chasing the technology. But also, I imagine that your task coming into an organization is providing some guidance on how do you integrate, these new emerging tools, and how do you approach that for a build out of a learning team.
Yeah, so I love AI. I absolutely love what it's doing. I know a lot of learning and development professionals have found themselves in a space of uncertainty, is what I'm going to call it. But AI is absolutely changing the learning landscape. But I think it's important to remember that it does not replace people. In fact, the more advanced AI becomes, the more important humans are in shaping how it's used. Because learning isn't just about speed, it's about discernment, it's about ethics, and it's about real world context, right? So I look at learning in levels, and the first level being basic knowledge transfer. Static, non-variable information you have to have in order to start, right? This is where our search engines and our AI are doing a really fantastic job. They can crawl, they can index, they can summarize faster than we ever could going through all of these documents, all of these research articles, and whatever else we have to Google to find, which means learners can also consume faster. And that's valuable, but it's only a start to learning, right? The second level is where we start to introduce variables. These are where the real world conditions, the decision makings, the nuances, this is where AI begins to struggle because the technology is not quite there yet. And it's because it doesn't have that kind of human discernment. And it can suggest possibilities, but it's not quite at the point of accurately weighing probabilities or context in the same way we do. Even with really good data and full visibility, it's really up to humans to decide, is this learning or is this AI hallucination? Or, hey, that doesn't really sound good. Or maybe my values and my ethics don't match up, because AI was created by humans and those humans had values, they had ethics, they have experience and exposure that they're bringing with them to create that AI, right? So that's what that AI is created off of. And the third level of learning, the one I'm most excited about, is when we develop people to becoming mentors. Now, this is a space where L&D has not been able to really tap into in a lot of organizations. A lot of times we get to that first level and we get to that second level, and then we end up changing so fast within the organization, we have to revisit and revisit and revisit. So we get this kind of like pinball effect that happens. But in this third level, we're starting to see this really emerge in which L&D can truly lead, not just transferring information, but creating environments where people can coach, where people can guide, and people begin to grow others. And that's really what's exciting about AI, making it to that third level and being more accessible, is because it's going to automate a lot of the busy work. We're talking about the content formatting, the information retrieval, the task rerouting. It gives learning professionals the time and the space to focus on humans. It gives the lean teams that game changer where they can go deeper into the learning and they can go faster than they've ever gone again.
Right. But it's all about keeping that focus on making it right for the person. And I love that you're making it person-centric and learner-centric. So before we wrap up here, I wanted to get your thoughts to help set expectations for folks who might be, sort of thinking of going on this journey of rebuilding a learning function, how long would you tell people to expect this to take?
Yeah, so that's a great question, because it'll take as long as, as it needs to take, but you will be able to move as fast as your alignment moves. And that's really what the deciding factor is going to be, is how fast can you get individuals aligned and on board with what you're doing? And then how much of your work can you delegate out to make sure that it is coming in through the right pipelines, and people are working, without you, basically. Um, so I've seen it be as fast as 6 months, where we've set up a learning and development team. We had an unlimited budget. We found the right people. We found the right processes. We had the right products. We were able to get everything set up, going. We had the organization operating very quickly, doing exactly what they needed to do when they needed to do it, and understood why they needed to do it. I've seen this process take as long as 2 years, and it really came down to stakeholder alignment. And it wasn't stakeholder alignment within, stakeholder to L&D. It was stakeholder to stakeholder. Ultimately, they were not aligned in moving towards the same goal. So when they had that constant pull at both ends, just like a rubber band, it doesn't really go anywhere. It just continues to flex and push and pull, and you end up in this hurry up and wait kind of feeling.
Right, and that can be really frustrating. But yeah, of course, we are not able to wave a magic wand and undo sometimes decades of ill will between colleagues, and that's the reality of the business world. Sometimes people have worked together a long time and simply can't get along for whatever reason, and that does not grease the skids. In any case, I loved your first scenario, which sounds like the dream scenario. Unlimited budget, tons of buy-in, everything just flows. But yeah, I guess it really does come down to alignment. Everything is that's either a huge enabler or on the flip side, a huge barrier.
Yeah, for sure. And that's really what it comes down to, is whether or not you can get the right people with the right process, with the right products, around the right politics, right? That fourth
around the right
P
politics too. Yes. All right, Jenessa Dowe Jacobs, thank you for being here. It's been a fun conversation. Thanks for being on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been the AXIOM Insights Learning and Development Podcast. This podcast is a production of AXIOM Learning Solutions. AXIOM is a learning and development services firm with a network of learning professionals in the U.S. and worldwide, supporting L&D teams with learning staff augmentation and project support for instructional design, content management, content creation, and more, including training delivery and facilitation, both in person and virtually. To learn more about how AXIOM can help you and your team achieve your learning goals, visit AXIOMLearningsolutions.com. And thanks again for listening to the AXIOM Insights podcast.